as we're presenting, you'll be hearing from a few different people. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and if we can, we'll answer them during the presentation. But we'll also be having a Q&A towards the end. So if it doesn't get answered during the presentation, we'll answer them towards the end. The slides are in the chat box if you want to save them to your computer, kind of follow along on your own. They are in the chat box. But once again, good morning and welcome to the presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. I can advance all your events in the slides. For the agenda this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about the grant award process from beginning to end, and then we're going to touch on the application itself, and we have some screenshots of the application so you'll recognize it as you're filling it out when we're discussing it. We're going to talk a little bit about the planning study process, kind of from beginning to end, and then we'll have LaDawn speak a little bit about the environmental review process and what's all entailed of that. Next slide. The grant priority list. For any of the systems that have received grant funding before, you might know that we get about $350,000 for our grants on each side. On any given year, we get more requests than we have money available, so we're not able to fund the entire priority list. This year, we did receive some ARPA funds. That's the American Rescue Plan Act. So if you hear the word ARPA, it's the acronym for American Rescue. And so we got quite a bit more money than we typically get on any other given year. As a matter of fact, we should be able to fund all of the planning grants, meaning if you submitted a letter of interest back in January, we have set aside money for you to receive funding from DEQ for 50% of the planning grant. The LOIs come in and we just kind of rank them from severe issues all the way down to minor issues. So if you have public health issues, you're most likely to rank pretty high. If you're looking to paint your whatever, if you're looking to paint something or not nearly as severe issues, you're probably falling further down on the priority list. So that's how we rank them. The priority lists are available on our website. So if you don't know where you're at exactly or want to see how much you qualified for all the funding, you're more than welcome to go to Idaho DEQ and go to the link on the slide, and you'll be able to pull up the priority list for this year and see exactly where you're at. The award process from beginning to end, as I mentioned, back in January, everybody submitted a LOI. We rank them from top to bottom. From then, we'll notify the systems that in this case, this year, everybody fell in the fundable range. So the next step will be to submit the application. Once the application is submitted, it's reviewed simultaneously between the regional engineers. They'll kind of take a look at the engineering side of things or the scope of work, what's going to be done. The state office will review the application just to make sure everything lines up with what's on the letter of interest. Once we get a thumbs up from the regional engineers that everything looks good on their end and we have everything we need, we'll go ahead and draft up a grant application at that point. Once the contract, not the application, but a grant contract. Once the contract goes out, it will already be signed by DEQ, which means that when the system receives the grant contract, that's when it's a legally binding contract, and that's when all the costs can be incurred. As after the grant contract has been signed, that's when your consulting engineers can start working on the facility plan. And at that point, you can start submitting reimbursement requests to DEQ for reimbursement for our portion of the planning grant. The red box there, just kind of another reminder that no costs are to be incurred prior to that grant contract being signed. So please keep that in the back of your mind as you are filling out these applications and going through this process. And from there, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia, and she's going to discuss some information about the handbook.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alicia, and I am a grant loan officer here. You'll be working with me throughout the grant application process. Before we deep dive into that grant application and the details, I just wanted to quickly mention our customer handbook. Some consulting engineers on the line might be familiar with our old handbooks. We used to have 4 for our grant and our loan programs, but now we have a new handbook, which is much easier to navigate, and it contains application forms and templates. This handbook is available on our website that's listed here. Here's a complete list of the grant application requirements. First, we'll need that signed planning grant application. That's attachment SRF 01 that's contained in that customer handbook that I just shared with you. The signed authorizing resolution, so attachment SRF 03, also included in that handbook, is a template. We'll need the signed engineering agreement and scope of work for your project, the engineer's professional insurance liability page, and for systems that are incorporated, nonprofit applicants or associations, we'll also need the articles of incorporation and or bylaws and the certificate of existence from the Idaho Secretary of State's website. Those systems will need items 1 through 4 and include items 5 and 6. All right, so here is a closer look at our planning grant application. As you can see in section 1, it's just general background information. It's really important that your system includes current information here since we will be sending out official documents. There are a few systems that are on our drinking water and our wastewater planning grant lists. Since we have a new application this year, it's pretty similar to other years, but now you'll be able to submit one application for both planning grants that you'll be applying for. You'll still need to include the copies of the scope of work and engineering contracts for each of your planning studies. In this section, you'll include your grant administrator and environmental review manager's information if it's applicable. It's usually pretty rare that systems outsource their work. It's usually done by their consulting engineers, but please do include those contracts if you will be having a grant administrator or an environmental review manager. For the project description, this can be pretty short, as you can just include, facility plan study for your system or I&I study. We will already have details and information in your scope of work and engineering agreement, so that's why this section's pretty short. For operator license information, you'll just need to include that. And for systems that are applying for a drinking water grant, please make sure that you're current on your drinking water fee assessments, and you'll need to be current on those to be eligible for funding. In this section, it's just eligibility and system type. Just include that information for your system. Incorporated nonprofit applicants, again, please include copies of those articles of incorporation and or bylaws, and the certificate of existence, again, from the Idaho Secretary of State's website. Section 3 is the environmental review section, just asking if you'll be completing this as part of your planning effort. As a reminder that environmental determination is needed in order to qualify for a state revolving fund loan later down the road. And if you are opting out, you have a few sections here just to certify that you understand that you might not be eligible for that construction loan later down the road. But of course, your system can certainly complete the environmental review later on if you're not wanting to do it under that planning grant. Section 3 is the budget information. This is basically a project cost of your the total project cost. Please specify the cost of your environmental review here. And under the proposed financing of total planning costs, just reminds you that DEQ does not cover more than 50% of the total planning cost, and you'll need to specify how you'll be covering your share of the grant. and if you'll be receiving funding from other agencies or sources. Section 4 goes over the engineering contract, just a checklist of what needs to be included. Just as a reminder, the engineering agreement must match the information that was submitted in that letter of interest, since points were awarded for different criteria. Under the section for certificate of negotiations, this is just certifying compliance with Idaho Code 67-2320 regarding the legal requirements for procuring engineering services. And again, you'll need to include your consulting engineer's professional insurance liability page. The last page of that planning grant application will just need to be signed by the person that's designated in your authorizing resolution, and we'll cover that in the next slide. The image shown here is an example of that template that's included in the customer handbook. What the authorizing resolution basically does is that it designates who can sign for any grant-related documents for your system. Just some helpful tips that we like to give systems is to designate more than one representative. You can include just a general title such as president or board mayor, rather than specifying a specific person. This just helps ensure timely processing of any grant-related actions. Usually some delays can happen if someone's out on vacation or there's any turnover, and in that point we would need a new authorizing resolution. So again, you can just list a general title in that authorizing resolution. For the certificate of existence, again, this is another example there listed on this slide, but this does only apply for those associations and incorporated nonprofit applicants. You can get a copy of this from the Secretary of State's website that's linked here. And the last item that I'd like to cover before we switch gears here is the new requirement from the federal government, which is having registration with the System for Award Management. Recently, we've moved away from requiring DUNS numbers to requiring full registration with the System for Award Management, it's also known as SAM, and a unique entity ID number. All systems that are applying for a DEQ funding are required to have an active registration with SAM.gov in order to receive funding. Active registration will be required throughout the lifetime of the award, and if you're not registered, then I would suggest getting started on this right away, since it might take up to 10 business days, and I know that they have certain form requirements that you need to submit through their website. DEQ will be verifying your active registration with SAM and also obtaining your unique entity ID number from SAM. And yeah, just please make sure that you're registered, and again, that'll be included in the grant contracts. But with all of that said, I want to introduce Nicholas. He'll be covering the engineering aspects of the planning study process.
All right, thanks, Alicia. So we wanted to give you kind of a bit of a sneak peek into the future once you have submitted that planning grant application and have signed the planning grant contract that hits the green light to start the planning study process. And so kind of wanted to look ahead a little bit of what you can expect for that. I know a lot of folks on this call have probably been through this process many times. So this is a little bit of a review, but if this is your first time, a little sneak peek into the future doesn't hurt. So again, once that planning grant contract has been executed, that's your green light to start the planning study process to begin developing a facility plan. So the first step in doing that is your consultant will begin working on drafting a facility plan. And so this is typically referred to as a technical draft facility plan. And that technical draft is usually a 75% draft that will get you all the way to a point where you can start making decisions on what direction your system needs to move. It isn't the final facility plan, but it's developed enough that you can start making decisions. And so that technical draft facility plan will be submitted to the DEQ regional office for review and approval. And once you've received that technical approval, that then triggers a few things. One of them being typically the environmental determination, which LaDon will talk a little bit more about later, a public comment period, and then also being able to officially select which alternatives will be moved forward, which projects will be moved forward. All this process, typically a system, this planning grant process typically helps a system bring a project forward, and typically those projects are seeking some kind of funding package, some sort of DEQ funding package, or maybe it's a rural development funding package. And so that's kind of what this process is typically centered around. Once those steps have been completed, then the final facility plan is submitted to DEQ for review and approval. And that's kind of an overview of the process and how it's kind of the high level milestones of the planning study process. Diving in a little bit more into the details, we do have a checklist in the customer handbook. We'll move to the next slide here. Perfect. Of what DEQ's expectations are for a planning document, for a facility plan. These checklists have been around for quite some time. A little bit of a new look to them with the updated customer handbook. Shouldn't be any surprises here, but these are intended to be guidance to help you hit a home run on those first submittals and try to keep the review loops as minimal as possible. And last but not least, once your consultant starts developing these facility plans, you're going to start to see invoices from your consultant, and this is your opportunity to go to the customer handbook, download that reimbursement request form. It's already kind of pre-populated for planning grants, and so there shouldn't be a lot of work, but you can fill in some of the project-specific details. It's a pretty straightforward form. A couple of things to note is it does require the signature of that certifying official and of the consultant. And typically we recommend that these are submitted monthly or as those invoices come in, but monthly seems to be a pretty good interval to submit these for reimbursement. You will sign, once these are signed, you'll send them to your regional office project contact, and it'll go through the DEQ processes to get you a check on the other end, because that's the important part, right? And so it's a pretty simple process, but definitely work with your regional office to make sure that these reimbursement requests are tailored to your specific planning grant. As Alicia mentioned, or Charlie, I believe it was, that previously incurred costs are not eligible, and so make sure that you're checking the dates on those invoices and those costs as they come in to make sure everything is above board. Also, to note, it is important that these reimbursement requests are track through the progress of the project. So in other words, we don't want to see one great big huge reimbursement request for the entire project come through and having not seen any technical draft or environmental review process having undertaken. And so in that light, we do, at a minimum, we do withhold 5% until the project is complete, which is really intended to make sure that those reimbursement requests are matching the progress of the project. So that's kind of a recap or a high level picture of what to expect after you've signed that grant contract. I'm going to pass it off to LaDon now. She's going to dive a little bit deeper into the environmental review process.
Good morning. Thanks, Nicholas. So the state environmental review process timeline I've put up here starts around the time that the draft facility plan has been approved by DEQ. And once that happens, I will typically reach out to the system and the engineers to plan a scoping meeting where we will go over the process, what kind of consultations might be needed, look at the different recommendations, and talk about what's going to be needed for the environmental review to receive a determination. So at that time, we'll discuss the information can be added to the facility plan or if a separate document, EID, will be needed. We will also loop in other funding agencies at this time to discuss who will take the lead on the environmental determination. So if Rural Development or Army Corps of Engineers or Community Development Block Grant are part of the funding, they have specific instructions for an environmental determination. And it's good to have all agencies on the same page to reduce the amount of work that may be needed. So if they're working on this, RD would likely take the lead depending on the project and funding timing, and DEQ would issue a concurrence with their determination. So as you can see up there, we would have that meeting, we would discuss everything, and then the system would move forward with choosing alternative, having a public meeting and public notice comment period, final environmental review documentation submitted, and review of the determination, and then DEQ would do a legal notice for public comment and send the determination paperwork to the system and engineers. And all of this, depending on how quickly everything is moving forward, can happen within a couple of months, or it may take longer, just depending on where everything is at. Next slide, please. So attachment 3B, which was formerly Form 5C in our old handbook, is what we'll use at the scoping meeting as an agenda to guide our discussion for the project and potential environmental determination. We'll discuss the project alternatives and other funding options if the project has any extraordinary circumstances that could cause issues. This would lead to a higher impact on the environment. These may trigger consultations that will require an EID and a FONSI determination. Next slide, please. This is a form continued, showing that we'll discuss the potential consultations, whether limited English proficiency or LEP requirements are needed for the public comment period and public notice, timelines, and ends with the actions that will be taken moving forward. And this would be filled out and sent to all of those participating in the environmental scoping meeting as kind of our notes. Next slide, please. So we frequently have documents that we ask for all projects when it comes to the environmental review process. And these documents should be added to the facility plan for CADEX. And if it's a FONSI, it'll likely include more documents as more consultations are needed in a separate document. And like I said before, this would be outlined and determined during the scoping meeting. So one of those is the Endangered Species Act Essential Fish Habitat list and DEQ memo. So we put that together. And typically I like to put these together around the time of the public comment period, as they are only good for 90 days so that we have them as long as possible or close to the time when everything is ready to move forward for determination. The public meeting notice will need to be added to the facility plan or EID. Any public comments that are received during that time, during the 14-day public comment period, meeting minutes with the chosen alternative that the system is moving forward with, an environmental screening table or something similar. Next slide. So this is an example of an environmental screening table. This is a really easy way to put together what your project is looking at for alternatives and what the possible impacts on the environment are going to be. So one like this I'm showing you can be added to the facility plan to show the potential environmental impacts for each alternative. You don't have to do this exact setup, but a review of the potential impacts, even if it's no impact, must be outlined and described for each environmental criteria and alternative. Next slide, please. And lastly, just a little overview of the last few years. So we've had a lot more CADEX determinations than FONSI determinations, and we've definitely seen an uptick in these as we've had more projects funded and more grants funded. The difference between them is not too different. A FONSI doesn't take too much more time. It just requires some extra consultations depending on the impact and the work that's going to be done. And it does involve a 30-day public comment period. An environmental determination is needed for an SRF loan through DEQ. So once you've done the planning grant portion and you're ready to move forward with construction of a project and you're applying for a state revolving fund loan through us, then you will need an environmental determination. And it's nice to have it done around the same time as the facility plan if possible. Contacts for the state environmental review process are myself, Sladon Killer, and Bonnie Record. So reach out anytime you have any questions regarding this process, even if you're not quite to the point that the facility plan has been approved. Sometimes we hear from you guys earlier and we can review things and let you know what it might look like beforehand. Thanks.
Thanks, Ladon. So just the last item that we wanted to cover today before we wrap up are just 3 types of grant amendments that we typically see. The first one is the increases. So if your project costs exceed what was originally requested, then some systems, you can go ahead and submit a request for an increase to your grant. Obviously, again, DEQ does not cover more than 50% of that total project cost, and documentation and justification for that increase will need to be submitted before the costs are incurred. The second item is the decreases. These typically happen when systems receive funding to complete their environmental review, but then later down the road, they choose to opt out and not complete that. In this instance, the grant funds that were originally budgeted for the completion of that environmental review would be rescinded. The last item is grant extensions. So typically you will have two years from the execution of that grant agreement to complete your planning process. So for systems that receive a grant in fiscal year 2023, the deadline would be June 30th, 2025. And if you need any additional time, later on you can submit a request to us in writing, and just so you know, those systems that are receiving ARPA funding, you will need to have your planning effort completed before December 31st of 2026. Otherwise, those funds may no longer be available to your system. Here's the contact information for the engineers in your region. Please feel free to contact them if you have any questions regarding your engineering agreement or your scope of work. As work is being done for your facility plan, they will be the primary contacts for any reimbursement requests, amendments, or any other engineering related questions. Perfect. So again, if you have any questions regarding the planning grant application, please feel free to contact me. My information is provided on this slide. Again, the forms that you saw today, they're all available in our customer handbook, and those are all on our website. Just to remind you of 2 important dates is September 2nd. That is the deadline to submit your intent to apply. This is just as easy as sending me an email letting me know that your system is still interested in applying for a planning grant. Again, that date's really important since there are some systems that get to this point and are no longer interested in applying for a grant. So please go submit that. And September 30th, that's the deadline to submit your entire planning grant application. The earlier that you submit your application, the quicker we'll be able to issue your grant award. And with that, I think we have some time for some Q&A today. So I think we can start checking the chat.
Hey, Christina, this is Charlie. The application deadlines, I thought it was December 30th. I think you might be thinking about the loan applications. The grant ones are the September deadlines. Next question regarding the 50% differential. I don't have a whole lot of good information on that. I would encourage everybody to reach out to some of the other funding agencies to see if they can help provide the other 50%. One thing to keep in mind on the grants is that it's a 2-year grant, meaning the system won't have to come up with their full 50% all at once. Usually the invoice or the consulting engineers invoice the system, periodically, as Nicholas said, maybe even monthly throughout the planning grant process. So I get the question sometimes like, how are we going to come up with all this money all of a sudden? So keep in mind, it's not all at once. It is spread out usually over the planning grant process. And again, I'd encourage you to reach out to whoever else can help fund the other 50%. And when I say other funding, I think RD, U.S. Rural Development, offers planning grant funding. I think Department of Commerce is getting ready to start offering some planning grant funds. And maybe even the counties. I know some of the counties received ARPA funding. So I would encourage everybody to reach out. I mean, the worst they can say is no, but I would encourage you to reach out to those systems.
It looks like we've got a question about hiring engineers in regards to nonprofits or homeowners associations. So the answer to, do you have to follow the qualification-based selection process? The answer is you need to follow what's in your bylaws or the rules that govern your nonprofit. And so that's what we would look to. I will also plug the handbook. There is a guidance document attached to that handbook for how to hire an engineer. DEQ is not involved in that process. We stay pretty distant from that process, but we do have some guidance on how to help you through that process, and you can find that in the handbook. So I think that probably answers that question. Looks like there's one more question from Jamie, and she asks if we're applying for other funding agency grants, can we use this planning grant to use as a grant match? And I think the answer is probably yes. So it's fairly common to have, we'll say, USDA Rural Development provide a 50% match to DEQ's 50%, and that's one way you can get the whole planning grant funded. Rural Development does have some other requirements and criteria that you have to meet to apply and receive their planning grants, but that's one way some people do it. Again, it has to be compatible. They both have to be planning documents, and it also adds another funding agency and other requirements potentially to the planning grant process that you have to be aware of. But it is something that has been done in the past successfully, and can be a way to leverage more funding if you're able to.
All right, so it looks like we're having some technical difficulties with sharing our slides today. So we'll email everybody the slides and a link to the recording at the end of the presentation today. And I think I saw somebody else's hand up. Steve Lambert, do you still have a question? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I do. You said that the intent to apply deadline for the 2nd of September can be met by emailing the intent to continue with the application process. Can you please specify who that email has to go to?
Yes, so you'll send that over to me. My name is Alicia Tapia Campos, and my email address is listed on this slide.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think I saw somebody else's hand up. Steve Lambert, do you still have a question? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I do. You said that the intent to apply deadline for the 2nd of September can be met by emailing the intent to continue with the application process. Can you please specify who that email has to go to?
Yes, so you'll send that over to me. My name is Alicia Tapia Campos, and my email address is listed on this slide.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Alicia, this is Gary. There's another question in the chat from Jeremy about a bridge loan.
Which I can unmute my microphone. I just know that our CAC is a CDFI lender, and we do bridge loans. And if a system is small and poor, like the commenter before, they can oftentimes get a bridge loan from us. I just was wanting to confirm if a bridge loan like that existed, could that be rolled over into the construction loan or anything for reimbursement for the system?
That's a great question, Jeremy. This is Nicholas. I'll take a swing at this real quick. So I think the answer is probably yes. It somewhat depends, but I would believe that if that bridge loan as part of the planning grant is consistent with and necessary to the construction loan. So in other words, if they were to move forward with an SRF loan, and it was within the scope of that project, then I believe the answer would be yes. That SRF loan could potentially absorb that bridge loan, that interim funding. But again, it has to be consistent with the scope of the project and part of the project. It can't be a separate, it can't be separate projects. So more than likely the answer is yes, because of the way the planning grant moves you into construction, and it's really kind of meant to be a seamless process. So that's how I would swing at that question.
Oh, thank you. And there were a couple of answers in the chat box too. So I just that's not my department within our organization, but if there were some small systems out there that were in need of that, then that might be an avenue for them then.
FY2023 and Stevens Fire TV stick.
All right, unless there's any other questions, I think we'll be wrapping up for today, and we'll make the slides available and upload this training onto our YouTube channel and send it out to everybody. Thank you so much for attending.